Is this thing on? All right. Levi, do you think anybody's listening?
We can only hope.
Think Eddie's listening?
At least.
All right. Well, let's do this. Well, hello and welcome everyone. This is our very first episode of Beyond the Oblong Box. This is entitled Behind the Mask of Crimson Death, Virginia and the White Plague. And the person who's on the other side of my screen is one of my favorite human beings on the entire planet. Someone who I feel is just, I couldn't do this without him, and I am so glad he is doing this with me. This is Levi Leland.
Thank you, Virginia. We go way back, at least a decade or more.
Oh, yes.
I think we're the right people for this job. Definitely.
I agree.
For this tab.
I concur.
Yes, we're the right people for it, and we are kindred spirits in Poe,
Absolutely.
in Virginia. And there's no better way to celebrate them, and share
Absolutely
their stories.
Yes. So with this episode that we're doing today, as this is being released, it's going to be January the 30th. And that is the anniversary of the day of this sweet woman's passing. Unfortunately, died due to tuberculosis. So this episode, we're going to be discussing Virginia and her life. We're not going to give away everything because we have other plans coming up.
We're going to try to be as concise and brief as possible, no matter how hard it's going to be. We're going to try.
Because, man, it's hard sometimes.
Yeah. But we have to have material for a future episode. So as much as we're going to want to fill it all, we're going to be quite reserved. So
yes,
this is a good introduction.
Yes, a nice little intro. Yeah. And so we're going to cover that. And then I've done quite a bit of research over the last couple of weeks. And I have to say I've had some very interesting dreams because I'm going to be talking about tuberculosis, what it is, the whole fascination with tuberculosis during the Victorian era. Stuff that actually, really honestly, I have to say, Levi, it really kind of scared me. I mean, I thought I knew a lot about tuberculosis, but then I learned a lot about tuberculosis. So
it's gruesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not pretty.
Yeah.
It's not
pretty at all, but it was a inspiration to the Victorians in a way.
Oh, big time.
And
big time.
I don't think there's a better word than consumption for what they entitled it, because it consumed them, physically, mentally, artistically, even as weird as that all sounds. I mean, it was literally consumption.
Oh, yes. I mean, makeup and beauty, the whole standards for women, quite frankly, a lot of that really did. I mean, yes, Victoria had her fashion, and that's why we know it as the Victorian era during her reign. But a lot of beauty trends and things were actually a derivative of the tuberculosis epidemic that happened in the 1800s. So, yeah. So shall we dive on in?
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to dig in. I'm going to tell the audience a little bit about Virginia herself and briefly go into her biography. Um, we don't really know a lot about her anyway. I mean, there's not a
Yeah.
ton out there about her besides some, anecdotes from the people Poe knew and the people who visited their home. And, you know, uh, there aren't many letters or materials that exist between Poe and Virginia. We're going to delve into that in future episodes. But, and she had a very short life. So there's just not a lot out there about her, but we're going to touch upon that briefly. So she was born in August of 1822 on the 15th. She was, and this year is her bicentennial.
Yes,
So
it is.
she'll be 200 years old this year, 2022. So another reason why she has been the inspiration to start this year, and this first episode is kind of dedicated to her as we delve into Poe in the future. But all about Virginia this episode, and she was a beautiful young girl. Everybody that met her remarked that she was kind. She was, she was pretty. She had large dark eyes, pale skin, dark brown hair. She was just gentle. She was sweet. And it's no wonder why when Poe finally met her in 1831, when he moved into her home in Baltimore on Amity Street with her mother, Maria Clemm, Poe's aunt, and their grandmother, Elizabeth Poe, who was bedridden and on her way out, that Poe just kind of really, he was just captured by little Virginia. I mean, he tutored her, he taught her music, and kind of took her under his wing as a, again, it's very debatable what kind of role he played, but a brother, a father figure, a cousin. I mean, just a solid figure in her life, and she was kind of the equivalent. She was a solid figure in his life that kind of kept him inspired,
Absolutely.
kept him feeling that sense of family and closeness. So she was 9 years old when he moved in to that house, and only after a couple of years of living together, Elizabeth, the grandmother, had died, and kind of left the family without any income. They were living off of her pension from the grandfather, David Poe. And so at that point, they were kind of, destitute. So Poe had gone to Virginia to work for a magazine and try to make an income. And he had to leave that little close-knit family. The first time he really found a close-knit family in his life. So, so far at that point, he had to leave Virginia and Maria Clemm behind. And another cousin, Nielsen Poe, offered to take Virginia in, take Virginia from Maria Clemm, and offered to, raise her and give her an education and give her a roof and food, because she wasn't really getting that, and Poe got really defensive about this. Poe was like, no, you're not going to take her away from me. That's my Virginia. And again, it's like scholars will debate. They have been debating, and they will continue to debate exactly what the role between the two of them was, because it's not clear, and we can only speculate, Poe's intentions, Virginia's intentions. But what we do know for solid fact is that they were a family. They were a family when from that moment Poe moved into the household until, they passed away, and they were a family. So at all costs, Poe was gonna keep Virginia his. So in May of 1836, on the 16th, Poe married Virginia. He did this to, take claim of her, and so that she couldn't be taken away by Nielsen Poe or anybody. Virginia
Mhm.
was his, and with Virginia came Maria Clemm, her mother, which was Poe's aunt. And this little trio was the family that stayed together always. So,
Mhm.
I often
Yep.
think in Poe marrying Virginia, he also gained Maria Clemm, at the same
Absolutely.
time. He
Oh,
he
absolutely.
cemented that family together, and so
Mhm.
um you know at the time of the marriage, Virginia was 13, almost 14. Poe was 27. Huge age difference there, of course, which
Right.
it wasn't even uncommon for first cousins to marry at that time. It was more uncommon, for the age gap was more uncommon than anything else. But because Virginia's father, William Clemm, had passed away years earlier and couldn't, hand Virginia over to Poe, Poe had to lie on the marriage bond and say that she was 21. And I think the minister that performed the ceremony, his name was Amasa Converse or something like that. He even
Can't
recounted,
remember.
yeah, it was something like that. I know Amasa or Amasa Converse, or there's one like photograph of him, and he looks wild. He looks like a wide-eyed old guy. He looks kind of nuts, but
Mhm.
he came out
Right.
afterwards and said that oh, Poe was a gentleman, and Virginia was, beautiful bride, but she looked young. But that's all he had to
Yeah,
say. I think
yeah,
they,
yeah.
yeah, I think they knew that, she was probably a little bit younger than what was said, but it was a different time back then. And, as much as it sounds so taboo now, it was different back then. But Poe married Virginia. They had a happy life together. Him, Virginia, Maria Clemm. They lived together, and moving from Richmond, Virginia, to Philadelphia, to New York.
Mhm.
Um, and there's so many fun little anecdotes about their little family that you wouldn't
Right.
imagine someone like Poe, the master of the
Right.
macabre, writing about premature burial and murder and all these
And
like
going and
gruesome
baking a
things.
pie.
Yeah, and going and baking a pie, Poe climbing a cherry tree and picking the cherries off and throwing them down to Virginia, who was catching them in her apron. It's
Right.
you wouldn't imagine that, but they did. They played together, they played music together, um, and they had a happy life, a happy union. Um, and while I'm talking about them playing music together and singing together,
Yeah.
um, January 21st, 1842, Virginia was playing piano and singing for Poe and Maria Clemm, and she started to cough up blood.
Mhm.
So Poe described this as breaking a blood vessel in singing. He
Mhm.
was not unfamiliar to tuberculosis. Tuberculosis took his biological mother, his foster mother, um, his brother, and it was
Mhm.
about to take his wife. And I think he
Yep.
knew this, but he was
Mhm.
in denial. In denial. I mean, and who
Yeah.
wouldn't be? He finally found a sense of belonging. He found a family, and
A
what?
stable family at that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a
He
lot to
found,
lose.
yeah, that he found that stability, and it was about to be ripped away before his very eyes, and
Mhm.
he knew this. So um, Virginia would get well, and then she would decline, and then she would get well, and then
Mhm.
she would decline. It was on and off for 5 years, and this is where that famous quote comes from. When Poe says, "I became insane with long intervals of horrible
Mhm.
sanity."
Yeah.
And so many people, I see so many people sharing that quote, and they're like, "This guy was mad. He was crazy. Look at," and it's
Right.
like, if you only knew the context of that quote.
Wrong context.
Right, right. I mean,
Yeah.
and I almost love telling people that, like, this, he had said this about his wife dying of tuberculosis, right? On and off, getting better,
Right.
getting worse, getting better, getting worse. this was not about his everyday life. This was about his
No.
slowly dying before his eyes.
Yeah.
And when you think of it in that context, it really is poignant, and it really hits hard.
Yeah. It
And that's why,
describes, yeah.
yeah, it describes the whole thing. And this is what's always so interesting about Poe, is that everything is taken so much out of context with him, and this is a perfect example of that. And we're going to dive
Terribly.
into that in future episodes, I know. And there's like a
Absolutely.
pile of information we can, use to exemplify this point. But here's one now, and it's that quote. And so, on and off, Virginia was dying, and for 5 years, almost to the day,
Yeah.
January 30th, which was,
Mm-hmm.
just 9 days after she, not, almost 5 years minus 9 days to when she
Yeah.
first showed symptoms. So
Yeah.
it's actually remarkable. It was almost exactly 5 years that she had passed away from that first,
Mm-hmm.
telltale sign of consumption. And after this, Poe was just distraught. He was
Mm-hmm.
lost. I mean, a neighbor, um, one of their neighbors in Fordham had later came out, and it said that he had watched Poe every night after her death, go to
Mm-hmm.
the mausoleum where she was interred. He would cover the grounds with flowers so that it was just always green with flowers. I mean, he
Mm-hmm.
mourned Virginia deeply after her passing. And this was in 1846, that she had, oh, I'm sorry, 1847, that she had passed away. And Poe died himself 3 years later.
Yeah.
And so this disease was just ravaging. It was awful, for obviously for Virginia, who had to suffer from it, but also Poe
Mm-hmm.
and Maria Clemm too, who had to watch it, and had to care for Virginia while
Mm-hmm.
she suffered from it. And as I had said, Poe didn't last long after that, and
Mm-hmm.
we're not going to delve too much into his death, but it just goes to show you how, this little family that stayed together from the moment they got together until Virginia passed away, and then Poe shortly after. And Maria Clemm lived a long, long life after both of
Oh,
them.
absolutely.
But
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe it was meant to be. She was around to, she moved in with different people that had come to be in Poe's life, and she, gave information and little tokens of Poe to these people. And without
Mm-hmm.
her, she kind of helped keep Poe's little legacy alive after his death.
Absolutely.
So
Mm-hmm.
before she had passed away,
Right.
and they're together now for eternity in Baltimore at the Westminster Burial Grounds. Poe lies in back of the monument that's erected to him at the
Yes.
front gates of the cemetery. He has
Yep.
Maria Clemm to his left and Virginia to his right. And,
Mm-hmm.
this little family, as I said, who stayed
Yep.
together in life, are now together for eternity. And,
Mm-hmm.
but again, we're here about Virginia, and we're here, you know, on the anniversary of her death. And as we had hinted at before, you have a lot of information to tell us about
A lot of frightening things.
that death.
Scary tales.
Yeah, I think I might have been, I might have sugarcoated it a little bit, but I know you have some really gruesome details about what exactly that might have been like for Poe
Yeah.
and Maria Clemm to watch, and how that might have felt
Absolutely.
for Virginia to suffer from. So I'm excited for you to share that little bit for our audience,
Right.
so that they can just
Right.
imagine what it might have been like.
Exactly. Yeah. So, wow, tuberculosis. So many things to say about tuberculosis.
Right.
First and foremost, it has been around since the dawn of time. I mean, every time archaeologists or scientists do any kind of research on fossils and mummies, all sorts of stuff. They're always finding, oh, well, this is tuberculosis. It's an older strain, but okay, now this is going back even farther. So they have determined that it is something that has been around for quite some time. As a matter of fact, in 2008, some archaeologists found a pair of skeletons that were buried together. When they did the analysis and the testing on them, they couldn't quite figure out what it was exactly that killed the two people that they found. But they did find the bones were riddled with the bacteria of tuberculosis. So it was quite a discovery, because those skeletons dated back to 9,000 years before. Wow. But they have found them in, like I said, in ancient Egypt. Some of the testing that's been done on various mummies in various tombs. A lot of them do contain that same bacteria, unfortunately. And it's something that not a lot of people realize, that it doesn't just affect your lungs. It's very much like cancer in that aspect, that, just because you have a certain type of cancer does not mean that it's not going to affect other tissues or, areas of your body.
And that's what I didn't realize about TB either, is that it does. It affects anything, everything,
a lot.
Not just
exactly.
respiratory. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. So TB, of course, tuberculosis, as we know it nowadays. Yeah. To the Greeks, it was phthisis. And the Incan society, it was called chaque-onque. And then, of course, the English call it tuberculosis. So the phthisis word in Greek actually means to decay. Okay. So,
I imagine it was,
it's like,
it was probably quite like decaying alive, essentially. I mean,
well, we're going to get to that.
Yeah.
We're going to get to that
spoilers.
In just a second. No spoilers. Yeah. So there are different types of tuberculosis. There's latent tuberculosis, which means that the tuberculosis bacteria is not actually active in the body. It's dormant. There are a lot of people in the world that actually have TB, and they don't know because it's latent. It's not active. Generally speaking, only about 10% of the folks that have latent tuberculosis actually progress to full-blown tuberculosis. With that being said, of course, the folks that do tend to progress from, sorry, cat, I have a cat in my lap, he's moving. So the tuberculosis that, is the dormant type, generally speaking, in folks that have pre-existing medical conditions, whether it's, asthma or kidney issues, liver issues even. A lot of times, if the health is poor, it will eventually manifest as active. It is very hard to test for TB. I mean, our tests nowadays obviously are much better than what they were back in. Well, there wasn't really testing for it in the 1800s. And what am I saying? But
they barely knew what it even was. I mean,
no,
they didn't
exactly.
even have like a real medical diagnosis for it. It was just, it's consumption. It's, it's
correct.
It's consuming the patient. It's that's what it is, but
exactly.
They couldn't pinpoint it,
Yeah, and there was a lot of medical leaps that were made. Mostly late 1700s, mid 1800s. And so, I mean, things like a stethoscope, that was developed. That was invented, I guess, is the way you want to say it, in the 1800s. And when that happened, my brain escapes the doctor who developed that, but he actually was able to, determine that what you were what they were hearing inside the lungs, they could actually tie that to the tuberculosis. So that was a big change. Tuberculosis, what it does, when it enters into the human body, it is an airborne infectious disease. It is transmitted through coughing, sneezing, spitting. But when and we ingest all sorts of stuff on a daily basis that we breathe in. We might drink it in our beverages and not even know it. Not trying to scare folks out there, but germs are everywhere. Just because you can't see them doesn't mean they're not there. Because they're there. But
and we know that all too well today.
It's
not like we're facing anything like that. Any kind of viral, thing that's going on right now that we're all,
not at all.
That caused a, pandemic or anything. Nothing like that. No. So we're fine. We're good.
We're cool. We're golden. But we actually have things in our throat that line our throat, membranes and enzymes that actually grab onto the things that are entering our bodies and neutralize them. Sometimes, though, things get past that and then they get into our lungs. And that's when we have these defense systems within our lungs.
Right.
And they literally will find the bacteria, grab onto it, envelop it, and then an enzyme within that is released to break down and neutralize the threat in the body. Unfortunately, TB actually has its own enzyme that slows down the production of that protective enzyme within our body, which allows the TB virus or bacteria, to actually produce at a much faster rate until it is now a big cluster of TB. And then as it's in the body, it's attaching itself to the tissue of the lungs, and then it's actually starting to deteriorate said tissue, decomposing that with your bronchial tubes. And when that happens, you start to have oxygen deprivation. You're not able to get that breath in. And so what happens when people are trying to breathe right, a lot of times coughing does occur. It's an involuntary reaction that our body does have with trying to catch breath, or if there's something stuck. And of course, because the tuberculosis is attacking the inside of the lungs and it's eating away at things, there's going to be irritation, there's going to be inflammation, and there's going to be blood. And so when we exhibit that coughing and that, release of that fluid, it usually is, with folks that have active tuberculosis, it is blood. And that's because the tissue is being eaten away and it's bleeding. Tissue bleeds. So eventually, as that happens, you also lose your iron, like your iron becomes depleted because of the oxygen deprivation in the body. And that's where things start to happen. And that's where we start to see that pallor of decomposition happening, that beautiful Victorian
glowing white skin.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're getting there.
Yeah.
And then of course also too, there's loss of appetite. So again, we've got, bodies that are just wasting away because they have no appetite. They can't eat.
Yeah.
And then of course there's fevers and chills and, and there can be moments where their body might recover a little bit, but eventually it's just going to keep wasting that person away as the tuberculosis is becoming systemic. And that is systemic miliary tuberculosis, where it does attack, it can attack your liver, giving you hepatitis. Lovely. It can also attack your spine, which will lead to Pott's disease. It can attach into the meninges of your brain, giving you meningitis. It can affect your adrenal glands. It can affect your kidneys. It can affect your
What doesn't it affect?
I know. Sorry. Little secret, everybody. I don't have my glasses on, so I can't read my notes.
But essentially, it literally, there's nothing that it can't affect. I mean, it will literally just run itself through your whole body.
It consumes your entire body.
And when you think about, you know, medicine in the Victorian era, it was nowhere near as advanced as it is today. So they didn't have a shred of a chance at combating this disease. Not even close.
Yeah, not even remotely.
And it was a literal death sentence in that time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
now there are still, like, to this day, according to CDC, NIH, I even saw something like this on, I think it was WHO, but they say that tuberculosis still does kill more people than malaria or HIV and AIDS.
Yeah. I mean, that's
in this
unbelievable.
day. This day, that's insane. It's insane. But I have a funny feeling that TB is probably not going anywhere, you know? So it's like, ooh. But, you know, that's why we have to keep ourselves healthy and, you know, not go crazy with things, everything in moderation, so that we can keep ourselves good. But, you know, the vaccines for tuberculosis really didn't become available until the early 20th century. And of course, with the creation of penicillin, that was like one of the things that started it. There are very effective treatments now, as long as you catch it in time. But again, because it's so hard to actually test and be definitive and say, yes, you have tuberculosis, because it doesn't always show up properly in tests. A lot of times it is almost too late. But and unfortunately, especially in the early days of the vaccines or the antibiotic treatments that they had for tuberculosis, a lot of folks would not even finish their antibacterial treatments. And so they would end up dying anyway. And they would say, oh, well, see, this doesn't work, but they didn't take the full course. And that's where we get, ready? Drug-resistant tuberculosis.
Oh,
because that's a thing.
Comes in all shapes and forms. Amazing. Oof. I mean, this is an aggressive, unrelenting disease. And I don't think many people realize that. I think anyone that knows of it probably has heard some, you know, 19th century story about it, or some figure in the 19th century, you know, who suffered from it. But I don't think they realize the extent of it today in the 21st century.
No, I mean, honestly, I knew it was not a pretty disease, and I knew that there were areas of the globe where, you know, modern medicine is not as easily accessible. You know, that, you know, it was probably still one of those things that, it does take out quite a few people, but I didn't even realize just how intense it still is now. So yes, that absolutely opened my eyes. So the Victorian era, as we all know, was from 1837 until 1901. This is when Victoria, of course, was Queen of England. And of course, fashions carried across. I mean, she was the Queen of England, and, you know, there was this whole idea of beauty. As a matter of fact, we'll get into the Pre-Raphaelites at some point. That's coming. But as far as art goes, you know, and especially in literature, there was a lot of this idea of women being delicate and dainty and bird-like and, you know, just oh so fragile and, you know, pale skin and doughy eyes that just sparkled and, you know, gaunt cheeks, you know, and it was all this depiction of tuberculosis. And in the early days of this tuberculosis epidemic in the 1800s during Victoria's reign, it was fashionable because a lot of high society folks, a lot of writers, musicians, you know, artists got this disease and died very young. All 6 of the Bronte children, all of them died from tuberculosis. None of them made it to 40.
Wow.
Not a single one. You know, Keats, he also died of tuberculosis. And actually, Percy Shelley wrote to John Keats at one point, "You continue to wear a consumptive appearance. This consumption is a disease, particularly fond of people who are, pardon me, who wrote such good verses as you have done." I mean, you know, he did.
To this,
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. You know, and then of course, with aesthetic goes makeup, goes clothing, you know, so women were wearing much paler, you know, much paler makeup. You know, they would do their rouge a little bit differently, you know, so that their cheeks were just a bit redder. They, you know, did stain on their lips, so their lips looked very bloody, because that was what you would start to look like as tuberculosis was taking you. And then, of course, with fashion, you know, the dresses of the Victorian era. Yes, there were corsets, of course. Yes, some women tight-laced, most did not. A lot of the silhouette, that gauntness that you had, it was all illusion, you know, bustle pads, hip pads, you know, very structurally designed specifically for that woman corset. Then, of course, there were patterns in the fabric, and, you know, a lot of it was illusion because the thinner you looked, the more emaciated you looked, the more beautiful you looked. Now, as we get towards the lesser end, the lower end, the later half, sorry, there we go, of the 1800s, it actually started to change because overcrowding conditions in workhouses and, you know, working class neighborhoods, everyone on top of one another, not having clean water, you know, sanitation wasn't the greatest, you know, in that time as well. And I mean, typhoid was running around then too. And, you know, syphilis was all the rage. Again, in the middle of this tuberculosis pandemic, basically,
right.
Or epidemic, I should say. And it started to become less fashionable because people who weren't as affluential were getting this disease also and dying. And then, of course, you've got the sanitariums that did open in the later half of the 18th century, where people were sent to these sanatoriums for rest and relaxation. And you had sunshine was your prescription, you know, fresh air was your prescription.
Clean air. Yeah. Clean air was another one, which is actually what I didn't mention, but I could mention now, was one of the things that a doctor had prescribed Virginia, which is why
Exactly.
they moved to Fordham, New York, which
Yeah.
at the time,
Yep.
now it's the Bronx, so it's in the middle of a
True.
chaotic city that's just bustling with trucks and cars and taxis and
Yeah.
noise and buildings and just craziness. But at the time,
But at that time,
it was Fordham, New York, and it was the country. It was clean air. It was
Yep.
sloping landscapes and trees and plants, and that's so they had moved to Fordham to get the clean air, and it was supposed to help heal Virginia's weakened lungs, and
yeah.
so a doctor now wouldn't necessarily prescribe clean air as a sole remedy for a certain disease, but back
No,
then that's all they
it
had.
was.
They
Yeah.
had no idea, so it was
Absolutely.
so
Yeah,
they
it
were more
was
different.
not. Yeah, it was. We would still have to go another, 40 years before we really got huge breakthroughs for tuberculosis. We did get there, just not in enough time.
Not in that time.
No. And so, they say that tuberculosis can take someone very quickly depending on their own personal internal health and, their, if they already have underlying conditions.
Right.
But, there have been some recorded cases of tuberculosis where someone lived with it for up to 10 years, 15 years before, they pass. So it's, just think about your body just continue. And the lungs, oh my God. It's, that's how you breathe, is that's not really a life. So in some ways, Virginia going 5 years with that.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that it was, a painless death.
Right.
There was
by no means quick and
quiet,
or quiet and not to mention too, they didn't have the best living conditions besides. They were poverty stricken family, so there's so many anecdotes from people who visited their cottage in New York, and they remarked, Virginia looked cold, but she was covered by Poe's military frock coat, and their cat was on her chest keeping her warm, and Poe would squeeze her hands and Maria Clemm would squeeze her feet to keep her warm. They didn't have the best living conditions besides, and Poe tried and tried and tried, and we'll get into that, I'm sure, in future episodes.
Another episode.
They relied on charity a lot, and many of these people did. I know someone I know a few instances where someone had donated the bed and someone had donated a blanket, and food, I'm sure, was donated to the Poes all the time, and so besides the disease taking over Virginia, her environment wasn't particularly luxurious to be dying of tuberculosis in. So it was probably overall just a very sad, dismal scene, and you could just feel why Poe felt the way he did, if you were in his place, and how it must have been to just see all this happen and struggle to give the basic needs and just barely be able to provide, it's a very, very gothic part of Poe's life, really. It's this, and as he so eloquently said, the death of a beautiful woman is the most poetical topic in the world, and Virginia was it. Virginia was it.
Yeah. So there we go. There we have it.
So I hope our audience learned a little something, and I hope there's questions for the next episode that we may be able to answer. you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So if you're on Facebook, of course, you know, it's Beyond the Oblong Box.
Yeah, give us a like there.
Find us,
And
like,
yeah,
feel
post.
free to ask questions there. We also have
Yeah,
a Facebook group, invite
yeah,
only. You have to request to join.
exclusive. Yes, you have
Yeah.
to get the golden ticket in your chocolate bar to be able to join that. So,
I didn't get one.
oh, sorry, I was too busy doing all the Oompa Loompa dances for the other entries. So you'll get yours.
Okay. Yeah. And then, of course, we're also on Instagram. You can find our links on Facebook. And then, of course, we are going to be broadcasting both on YouTube and, of course, on every single podcast app on the planet. We will be doing the first and third Sundays of every month. And on our second and fourth Sundays of every month, we're going to have little bite-sized bonus episodes that we're going to do where we're just going to cover something small, something sweet, give you a little something to nibble on in between the big guys.
Yeah, that would be great. And even answering questions too in those little mini episodes.
Absolutely.
Just kind of free ball it a little bit and, you know, have some fun dialogue there and answer some of those burning questions that our listeners may have. So I'm excited. I'm excited for all that. And our email too.
Yes.
btob1847@gmail.com. You know, if that's more convenient for anybody to email questions there or comments or anything that you might want to see from us in the future, we'd love any kind of input. I mean, don't worry, we both have, between the two of us, we have ideas to make these episodes last for 200 years for our bicentennial. So don't worry, but we would still love to hear any remarks or advice or comments or ideas that you may have. So.
Yep. Well, Levi. Sláinte. All right, everybody. Well, we will see you next week for our next episode.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.